come to have two different meanings that are all too rarely distinguished. The first is what I call the lived experience of diversity. The second is multiculturalism as a political process, the aim of which is to manage that diversity. The experience of living in a society that transformed by mass immigration, a society that is less insular, more vibrant, more cosmopolitan, is obviously immensely positive. It's a case for open borders and open minds. As a political process, however, multiculturalism means something very different. It describes a set of policies, the aim of which is to manage diversity by putting people into ethnic boxes, defining individual needs and rights by virtue of the boxes into which people are put, and using those boxes to shape public policy. It's a case not for open borders and minds, but for the policing of borders, whether physical, cultural, or imaginative. This conflation of the lived experience and political policy has proved highly invidious. On the one hand, it has allowed many on the right, and not just on the right, to blame mass immigration for the failures of social policy and to turn minorities into the problem. And on the other, it has forced many traditional liberals and radicals to abandon classical notions of freedom and liberty, free speech, for instance, or traditional notions of equality, in the name of defending diversity. Now, I believe it critical to defend diversity as lived experience, all that goes with it, such as mass immigration and an open culture, but also to oppose multiculturalism as a political process. The irony of multiculturalism as a political process is that it undermines much of what is valuable about diversity as lived experience. When we talk about diversity, what we mean is that the world is a messy place, full of clashes and conflicts. And that's all for the good, for it's out of such clashes and conflicts that political and social engagement emerges. But the very thing that's valuable about diversity, the clashes and conflicts that it brings about, is the very thing that worries many people. On the one hand, you have the Little Englander sentiment, that immigration is undermining national fabric, eroding our sense of Britishness or Englishness, turning our cities into little Lahores or mini Kingstons. And on the other hand, you have the multicultural argument, that diversity has to be policed to minimise cultural frictions by passing people up into neat cultural and ethnic boxes. But far from minimising conflict, what it actually does is to generate new sets of more destructive, less resolvable conflicts. Now, when I say that clashes and conflicts are all for the good, I don't mean that every clash and conflict is good. Political conflicts are often useful because they repose social problems in a way that asks, how can we change society to overcome that problem? We might disagree on the answer, but the debate itself is a useful one. Multiculturalism, on the other hand, by reposing political problems in terms of culture or faith, transforms political conflicts into a form that makes them neither useful nor resolvable. Political struggles potentially unite across ethnic or cultural divisions. Struggles over culture, ethnicity or faith inevitably fragment. Multiculturalism has come to be seen as a means of empowering minority communities and giving them a voice. In reality, such policies have empowered not individuals, but so-called community leaders who owe their position and influence largely to their relationship with the state. Multicultural policies tend to treat minority communities as homogeneous wholes, ignoring class, religious, gender and other differences, and leaving many within those communities feeling misrepresented and indeed disenfranchised. As well as ignoring conflicts within minority communities, multicultural policies have often created conflicts between them. In allocating political power and financial resources according to ethnicity, such policies have often forced people to identify themselves in terms of those ethnicities and those ethnicities alone, inevitably setting off one group against another. Now, you can see this in almost any British city, but let me use as my illustration Birmingham. You might recall 7 years ago, in October 2005, there were riots in the Lozells area that pitted black and Asian communities against each other. Now, 20 years before that, in 1985, there had been another riot, this time in Henswood, next door to Lozells, in which blacks and Asians had fought not against each other, but together in protest against poverty and police harassment. Why did two communities that had fought side by side in 1985 fight against each other 20 years later? The answer largely because of the Council of Multicultural Policies established in response to the original riots. In the late 1980s, Birmingham Council created a series of what they called umbrella groups based on ethnicity and faith, the function of which was to represent the needs of specific communities, Vietnamese communities, African Caribbean churches and so on. The consequence was to treat each community as a homogeneous whole and as different and distinct from other communities. The Council's own report put it that the policy ignored class, intra-religious and gender differences within these communities, so many feel unrepresented, even misrepresented. At the same time, as another study put it, these same policies tended to result in competition between black and minority ethnic communities for resources. Rather than prioritising needs and cross-community working, the different umbrella groups generally attempt to maximise their own interests. In other words, multicultural policy in Birmingham, as elsewhere, has effectively created communal politics, the end result of which were communal riots. Multicultural policy, it seems to me, both constrain the kinds of clashes of opinion that would be potentially useful and unleash the kinds of conflicts that are socially damaging. I oppose multicultural politics because I favour an open and diverse society. Thank you.
As well for inviting me to participate. What I'd like to do is to say something very briefly about what I think multiculturalism is, mention some positive things about it, as well as some criticisms that people have, and then suggest some ideas that we have to think about if we're going to make multiculturalism better. So, what do we mean by the word multiculturalism, and what do we mean by the word fail? Let me start by referring to the words of Lord B.Q. Perrick. For those of you who don't know him, he was one of the authors of the seminal report in 2000 on the future of multi-ethnic Britain. He describes multiculturalism as, quote, a vibrant respect for diversity and shared common values. He also observes that his understanding of multiculturalism is that human beings are shaped by particular cultures which are in themselves not monolithic. Furthermore, it is both inevitable and desirable that these cultures interact with one another, developing and changing in the process. He also notes that multiculturalism can best be understood as different communities having different needs because they are structurally disadvantaged or lack the skills and the confidence to participate in and take advantage of opportunities within mainstream society. Remedying this might require such measures such as group differentiated action, state support for minority institutions, and a judicious program of affirmative action. This is not, nor should it be, incompatible with having common values. So what about the word failure? If we do not have a common understanding of what multiculturalism is, then it follows that we do not have an understanding about what constitutes failure. In other words, what are the outcomes, aims, and targets do we use in determining whether or not multiculturalism has failed? Without such agreed measures, to talk about the failure of multiculturalism is essentially meaningless. Multiculturalism is not a static, monolithic entity, but it is something that means different things to different people, such as diversity, social inclusion, integration, anti-racism, as well as the more mundane manifestations of difference, as personified by dress, religious practices, and food. It's become victim of simplistic analysis in common with so many issues, made worse by knee-jerk criticism from certain politicians and certain sections of the press. Additionally, it is criticized from the left as being reactionary and from the right as being typical of the nanny state, force-feeding us with unthinking political correctness. Consequently, it has become a scapegoat for many of society's ills and is demonized in the same way that other issues are, such as immigrants, immigration, migrants, asylum seekers, anti-racism. And of course, this demonization gives succor to groups like the English Defence League and the British National Party. So what is positive about multiculturalism? Let me briefly mention two areas, health and education. Multiculturalism can help us to consider important interventions which take into account certain cultural and religious needs, thereby increasing the likelihood that such an intervention will be successful. So, for example, it may be necessary to target particular groups who have a high prevalence of particular diseases, such as South Asians and diabetes, Orthodox Jews, using screening programs. Multiculturalism can also deepen our understanding of the changing nature of Britishness, for example, in the way that it's broadened children's horizons in the classroom. This is more than necessary now, given the proliferation of faith schools and the way in which some schools have become de facto segregated. I think the question we need to ask ourselves, if we do not want multiculturalism in the classroom, then what do we want? Let me turn to a few criticisms, and I will briefly highlight 5. Yes?
Sure. So what do you think the main objectives of multiculturalism are? Because so far we've heard from both sides lots of reasons why multiculturalism might be good or bad,
Right.
but a little about what their objectives would be and how it might have failed.
Well, perhaps we can take that, become clear at the end, and if it hasn't, we'll come back to that. Is that okay? Right, some criticisms. It can encourage inappropriate policies. This is not to say that there have not been some inappropriate policies, and sometimes even some daft ones, say, like, you're not allowed to say black coffee. But we also know that a number of these policies that people say have been done in the name of multiculturalism have been really the result of myths and a lot of mischief-making as well as exaggeration. Inappropriate policies can also be synonymous with actions which are done for the best motives but are mired in confusion, uncertainty, and complexity, such as fostering and adoption policies. And we also know that inappropriate policies can also take place in a monocultural society. If we look in the past, we have to think about the way that Empire Day was celebrated in schools. And a more current example, which I think is also daft, is Michael Gove giving out Bibles to every school in the country. A second criticism, it can divide communities. Well, we know that it can divide communities, but is it a part of the divide and rule which so many politicians like to manipulate communities so that we have the disabled? We also know that there are a number of studies which show that so-called ethnic minority communities actually have a deeper attachment to Britishness than to the so-called indigenous white community. Does it encourage sleepwalking into segregation? The real issues that divide Britain are issues like poverty, wealth, opportunity, and these are much more substantial divisions than defined by race, ethnicity, and religion. And I've run out of time.
I'm not an academic, I'm not an educator, I'm not a broadcaster, although I do advise EastEnders. What I do is I prosecute, and I prosecuted the Rotterdam 9 rulers, others fear to tread. I prosecuted the murder of Anuj Bidve, the Indian student. I prosecuted the 2 alleged murderers of the Manchester police officers. I prosecuted cricket corruption. I prosecuted thousands of cases over the time. I'm the National League on Honor-Based Violence, Forced Marriage, Child Sexual Exploitation. I'm prosecuting Jimmy Savile and Cyril Smith and other dead people too. My responsibility is to keep you safe and to work with the police colleagues to do so. I'm not, as the introduction suggested, against multiculturalism. I'm in favour of rights. My view is that a rights-based society is what we should be building, and what multiculturalism does is it denies people rights. And I'll come on to that in some detail as we progress during the course of the next few minutes. I'm a son of an immigrant. My family came here to seek opportunities. I was beaten black and blue by racists in the 60s and 70s. Yeah, in the 60s and 70s. There you go. Now 400. In the 60s and 70s,
I've been married 3 times. My first was Irish Catholic, my second was Hindu Indian, and my third was East London Sikh. My case here is simply that this comes down to polemics. People think that you either have to be the happy clappy brigade and you talk about how wonderful multiculturalism is, or you've got to be far right, and I've dealt with the far right. You may not have. I have dealt with them, and they have been brutal to me. Because they don't like the narrative of a British Pakistani Muslim prosecuting British Pakistani Muslims. Somehow they feel that actually negates their case, that we're all the same. And my perspective is that this country is not the same. You have Scots, Welsh, Northerners, Londoners, you're all different, and you've never become the same, but you are guided by the same rules and laws as we all are. And that has to be the way it must be. What's happened, however, is that multiculturalism sensitivity has led to moral blindness, and that people are now suffering because people are relying entirely upon this multicultural agenda as driving the way things are forward. Now, I had a speech, and I'll talk to you, I'll forget the speech, I'll talk to you about cases. I've dealt with hundreds of honor-based violence killings in the last 10 years, more than probably anybody else in the world. I've dealt with people who have been the most vulnerable in society, who've been let down because people, through political correctness or multicultural sensitivity, have said it's a matter for them. Leave them alone, let them carry on, let them do their own thing, and somehow or other it'll all turn out right at the end. But Naz Mahmood was killed because she kissed somebody 4 miles away from here. She was killed by her own family and by 3 other men, all of whom were successfully prosecuted. Why? Because somehow or other somebody felt that was against their culture, and therefore her death was a result of that. Our perspective has to be that she needs protection, and that our society, any society that denies her protection, cannot be the way it should be. And regrettably, that's what we have in our country as it currently stands. We buy our baubles, we have the Buddha on the shelf, and we listen to panpipe music, and we think somehow or other we're all multicultural and we're all really sensitive to each other's views. But this is where it's real for people. When they realise actually, because of their background or where they come from, they will be treated differently. And the society that we've now created, it means that they will suffer significant harm. We can't have that. You know, last week I learned that there are hundreds of young girls in this country who have their clitorises taken off in the name of whatever culture they're part of. How can we allow that? How can we allow people to be forced into marriage? 8,000 to 10,000 in this country forced into marriage because of their culture. None of these things are possible or right in our society, yet somehow or other we allow it to happen.
On this point?
Yes.
So do you think people who feel this strongly about their culture and the rights of their culture are more or less likely to try and propagate that culture, the point in which the state ceases to recognise it as legitimate?
I'm not going to criticise any particular culture, because my point is that all cultures need to be treated equally, and all people who are vulnerable need to be treated equally. My perspective is that whenever I deal with the grooming cases, people were saying, oh my God, all these Asian Pakistanis are grooming young women. 96% of the people I deal with are white British males involved in child sexual exploitation. That context needs to get out there before you focus on this particular issue. It's an issue, but it's not the issue. My point is that any individual, regardless of what culture they're from, whatever community they're from, requires the protection of the law, protection of the state, protection of all the authorities that we have. But because we hide behind or allow these people to get on with their own lives in their own ways, we're putting people at risk, and we can't have that in this society. One murder I dealt with just a few years ago, Kanis Riaz, she was murdered together with 4 of her children in Accrington. And she was murdered by her estranged husband because he couldn't cope with the fact that she was working in fighting for women's rights. Now, when she was murdered, there were members of his community that said, oh no, the house was haunted. They would rather believe it was a ghost than a man that killed those 5 people. And yet, we allow this to happen. You know, I recently did a news night about how witchcraft is used to abuse children in this society. Victoria Climby, a classic example. From our perspective, we've got to have the same rights for everybody. And a rights-based society is the only society, quite frankly, that protects the people that we have. Yes, I am totally with you. I think we learned earlier on, I think you confused diversity with multiculturalism. I think absolutely right. The health service, education service should be diverse so it provides the right level of service to people within those organisations who want that service. what we have,
What is,
I think in the last meeting you're not allowed to. Don't worry about it. I gave evidence in the Parliament not long ago to talk about the hundreds of girls that are taken out of school because they're denied an education. We can't have a society that denies people education, denies people the right to marry, whom they marry, when they marry, if they marry, denies people the right to leave those relationships when they're abusive, means that they commit suicide. Three times as many people, South Asian women, commit suicide than any other group in society. From my perspective, a rights-based society is the only society that's sustainable, and we've got to make it work. Thank you.
And you got another Chicagoan up here with you too. I don't know what it is, but anyway. Let me take it back a bit, because I don't have those kinds of examples to give you, and as powerful examples as well. I want to talk about a reality that uses a rather clunky, outmoded, stupid word that as far as I'm concerned, the word multiculturalism can be dumped. I think it's out of date. And I also like to dump the word race because it's unscientific and it has no meaning. It's ironic that we're having a debate about multiculturalism in a building named after Darwin. I'm not sure that essentially in the most scientific part of himself, he would understand what this debate is about. As Zhou Enlai said once about the French Revolution, some people say it was actually about Paris in '68, whatever. Multiculturalism has failed. Zhou Enlai would say it's too soon to tell. The fact is that such a complex evolutionary process, given a name for policy purpose, is a question in its entirety that all of us in this room are too old to answer. The train has left the station. Now, we can change the name, but we can't change the reality. And the reality is that perhaps that nasty word again, multiculturalism, might be the best thing that came out of British colonialism. Multiculturalism has not failed. It is the first, perhaps rough phase of an evolution that some policymakers were attempting to get a handle on. They messed it up, it decayed, people took their eye off the ball, whatever you want to call it. But it has not failed because at its deepest level, it is preparing this nation for the only role that an aging Western European mid-sized nation can have in an increasingly non-Western world. The ability in its multiculturalism to talk, to engage with the world to come. Multiculturalism allows the UK to compete and to thrive, and besides, you can't stop it anyway. With more under fives here in London with one non-white parent, for instance, my neighbor, who is 1 year old, his name is Oliver, after Oliver Cromwell, speaks English, Croat, and French. This is his world. It's not ours. Instead of being afraid of it, we have to come to understand what is inevitable and unstoppable. You call it what you want.
I want you to know what's the difference between multiculturalism and ethnic diversity?
I have no idea what ethnic diversity is, and I don't know what multiculturalism is. If you want to talk about the policies, I don't know. But so I can't tell you. Are you asking me in relation to what I just said?
Yeah, because you said multiculturalism is inevitable. And I want you to
No,
know
I said multiculturalism is a policy that you can take the name off of it if you want to. You can call it, say whatever you want. The inevitability is that we're coming together in different forms and different shapes. I don't know what ethnic diversity is. I don't actually believe in it. Okay, if we have values that we believe, the only thing we can do is that if we have values that we believe in, we better start getting ready to transmit them, and we better get cranking because we can't stop this juggernaut. History is moving south and east, and we in the north and west, we better understand this and be glad that this nation is a home and a haven for the future and not the past. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for inviting me. I am saying that multiculturalism has not failed, joining my two colleagues here. Firstly, success and failure is measured by some criteria in my view. Those who propose that multiculturalism has failed have, in my view, presented futile arguments to back up their own statements. If nothing else, they've supported ours all the way. In my view, their statement is based on fear and scaremongering, not facts. It was Mr. Cameron who, of course, said in a speech to a bunch of security personnel, experts and industry that multiculturalism has failed. You have to understand the context in which he was saying this. He was trying to woe an industry that, of course, would depend on such a statement. An industry that would be interested in selling its gadgets and its equipments to keep us safe, in quote-unquote, from the terrorist attack. But no, it's only about money and making gains and profits. Mr. Cameron and his friends are not wrong, but they have failed to propose. They're completely wrong, but also they have failed in proposing a credible alternative to multiculturalism. He has suggested that we should all have muscular liberalism. I don't know what that means. I still haven't understood, and he hasn't explained. Let me define my idea of what multiculturalism is. In my view, the essence of multiculturalism is a simple one. It's where minorities feel welcome. We allow, or we all together share the cultures by seeking to address discrimination against one another. This will, in other words, allow people to reciprocate and embrace the cultures and the facilities around and the values of the communities around, and therefore create a harmonious society. So those of you who are wondering, how do I corroborate my own belief that multiculturalism has not failed, the opponents of multiculturalism have spread myths in my view, and the myths are as follows. Number one, multiculturalism encourages exclusion rather than inclusion by siphoning minority communities away from the mainstream and condemning them to live a parallel life. In 2010 ethnic minority British election survey, which questioned a number of UK main minority groups such as Indians, Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, Black Caribbean and Black African, it examines the alleged claim that multiculturalism has failed. Let me quote the summary of it as given by the Guardian newspaper. The report reveals that while some first generation of minorities do tend to marry and mix within their own ethnic minority groups, they also mix within neighborhoods and workplaces, showing a definite willingness to integrate. The second generation, however, those educated and born in this country or raised in this country, show a further shift towards integration with greater social and workplace mixing and a significant increase in marriages across community divides. The results show that black groups especially have little or no problem contemplating marriage with white people. The notion that even the most inward-looking minority is entrenched in a parallel society is a gross overstatement. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm British, Bangladeshi, European Muslim. I'm married to a white Hungarian European woman who converted to Islam 2 years before we got married. Just let me finish, then you'll come. I'll get you to speak in a minute. Our children, however, some of you would think are very confused. They're not. They're very, very clear about their identities. If you ask my 6-year-old daughter, she said to me the other day, "Daddy, I'm half Hungarian and I'm half Bangladeshi and I'm fully English." My son, who is only 4, he turned around and he goes to me, "No, Daddy, she's wrong. I, on the other hand, am a SpongeBob." In his own words, very happy. Sorry, what did you want to say?
You know exactly what you're talking about is cultural integration, and I think everyone on the panel supports that. And the proposition is saying is that multiculturalism actually separates cultures by saying,
well, let me finish the 3 other.
Different and equal. And what you're talking about is integration, which is positive, but it's different, and you need to address the point.
So let me go through my myths, then you will get to understand how I'm answering some of their questions. So, myth number 2, by living parallel lives, minorities preserve their ethnic behavior and values that run counter to a broader society. Data from 2007 England and Wales Citizenship Survey reinforces the finding that it showed more than 89% of both Indians and Pakistanis, 87% of Bangladeshis, 84% of Black and African and Black and Caribbean when they were asked, do you feel British? That was their response, as opposed to 85% of white British who felt British enough. Now this is an interesting survey, an interesting outcome. Do you all live a parallel life? I can see many colours, many shades, many cultures in this very room. I don't think you do. You're all here to celebrate what we call multicultural identities and multicultural environment. In my view, that's the reason why multiculturalism hasn't failed. In fact, if anything, it celebrates it. It's the only country, in my view, in this country that we can do. But here is something else that I want to tell you. In Britain, there has been a revolution that has taken place. It's not the Arab Spring, nor is it the Asian summer. It's called the Carib Revolution. It's an irony that the parallel communities have actually invaded every village, every town, every city in the UK with Indian restaurants. Now, for those of you who feel that multiculturalism has failed, this is an example of how societies don't live, or minorities don't live a parallel life. They actually do contribute and make a substantial input to the lives of people around them. Myth number 3, they say that these separate communities provide fertile soil for radicalization. That is so untrue. Let's be honest about this debate. We're talking about politicians utilizing the 7/7 bombing to blame one community and one community alone, that's Muslims. That minority groups staying in multicultural environment will find reasons to become radical. Well, Mr. Tony Blair refused to accept the link between Iraq invasion that was illegal and the 7/7 connection, even though experts after experts, reports after reports said exactly that. Mr. Blair and all the other experts were told that it's our foreign policy blunders that make people angry and radical. It's what feeds the extremists and fuels terrorism. Our acute failure to bring fairness in Palestine and Israel, our acute failure in sorting out the Middle East, etc. So in my view, multiculturalism doesn't feed any of that. If anything, it creates a perfect environment for creating a harmonious society where we have respect for one another, we accept one another for who we are, and we celebrate the differences, and that's the reason why multiculturalism.
3 points. One, that we are in the decadent phase of government policy that has attempted to name an unstoppable revolution. Doesn't mean that this policy is a failure. It has accomplished what it set out to do in a broad sense of the term. I am Deputy Chair of the British Museum. I would argue that I would possibly not be there if there wasn't for multiculturalism and a lot of people at the British Museum. Number 2, the unspoken assumption of those for the motion is that there's some kind of British identity. The genius of this nation is that there is not, because there is no British state. There is no British state in the sense that there is a French state and the sense that there is an American state, with constitutions which attempt to define what the French person and American is. That to me is one of the geniuses of this country. And the fact that we can incorporate into our language the word refugee brought over by the Huguenots in the 17th century, who were allowed and who stayed here and became whatever the hell British is. The bottom line of those for the motion, let's face it, ladies and gentlemen, is fear. The fear of the loss of place, the fear of the inability to achieve values transmission. Well, I think we better get busy and do that if we want to win the future. And the last thing that I will say, if I can find it, is that the UK has the opportunity now to understand, to demonstrate that we understand the world we live in right now and the world to come by embracing multiculturalism, change the name, change it, whatever, and develop better strategies for it, because as I said before, the world is moving in the opposite direction, and for our nation, northern and aging and post-industrial, we are beautifully set to be able to talk to the world to come, because we are multicultural. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I can't but have to comment on the point about Islam that was made earlier on. to just put it right, it has nothing to do with Islam. Any of those practices, as you know, female genital mutilation predates Islam, is an African tribal culture, and it is condemned by Islam categorically. Scaremonger, using false as well as connecting things that has nothing to do with religion, is in itself an evidence as to why I think you should vote against the motion. Now, I want to say something, two things. Firstly, the reason why I think multiculturalism has succeeded. The fact that we are here today, able to discuss and debate so openly and without fear, we can go into our streets and live in our own homes comfortably. I'm afraid I didn't have that when I was younger. I still remember bricks being thrown at my father's car, me sitting inside, my face cut because of the glass. I still remember dogs being let loose on me by my neighbor. Those days are long gone. We fought against racism. We fought and we gave blood and we sacrificed our day, our time in order to get rid of it. Multiculturalism is what succeeded that particular fight, and that's the reason why you should support the idea, and that is that multiculturalism hasn't failed. And the third, ladies and gentlemen, we are ultimately the same. We're human beings. No matter which color and country and culture you come from, you are the same. We are the same. But it's amazing, while we're the same, we still have different preferences. We are made of different substances in our thinking, in our perception. I'm a relationship expert. I deal with marriages and failures on a daily basis. I tell you, every man and every woman who comes through my door, whether they are Muslim, Sikh, Hindu, Jew, Christian, all the marital problems are exactly the same. Being married to a Hungarian, me being British, Bangladeshi, I'll tell you, if it wasn't the diversity that we have, we won't be so happy and so excited in our relationship. So I believe multiculturalism works if you know what it means. And finally, I want to share a joke with you. When something is good, everyone wants to be part of it. So a group of people were trying to prove Jesus was the following. 3 people were proving that Jesus was Mexican. They said, his first name is Jesus. He was bilingual, and he always was harassed by the authorities. Another group of people said Jesus was black. He called everybody brother. He liked gospel. And he couldn't ever get a fair trial. Another group of people were trying to prove that Jesus was Italian. Because Jesus used to talk with his hands. He always had wine with every meal. And he worked in the building trade. A group of people were trying to prove Jesus was Californian. He had long hair, never cut it. He walked around barefoot, and he started a new religion. Just finishing. Another group of people wanted to prove Jesus was Irish. He never got married. He was always telling stories, and he loved green pastures. And finally, a group of people were trying to prove that Jesus was a woman. He had to feed a crowd at a moment's notice when there was no food. He kept trying to get the message across to a bunch of men who just never got it. And number 3, even when he was dead, he had to get up because there was more work for him to do. Oppose the motion.
Thank you very much to all of the opposition speakers for their closing remarks. So we're now going to turn to the opposition side of the
Unfortunately, I've got no jokes for you, so it's just some arguments. It seems to me that what is insufficient to argue against this motion, it is insufficient to say Britain is a diverse country. It's become diverse, it'll become more diverse, and that's a good thing. We all accept that. It's insufficient to say mixing is a good thing. We all accept that. It is insufficient to say Britain used to be racist, we fought a huge struggle against that racism, and that's a good thing. We all accept that. I mean, I've been an anti-racist for 30 years. I'm opposed to multiculturalism because I'm an anti-racist. I remember back in the 80s organising street patrols in East London to protect Asian families against racist attacks. So it's insufficient to say we're races, we like diversity, we like mixing. That's not on the table because there's no difference on that. The point I raised at the beginning, which is there's a distinction between diversity as lived experience and multiculturalism as a political policy. Nobody has addressed that. Everybody's taken the first part, which is to say, we believe in diversity, fine. But the point I was making was that as a set of political policies, it undermines much of what is good about diversity as lived experience. Edie, in her opening remarks, quoted Bikku Parekh saying that different communities have different needs. That's the kind of basis of multiculturalism. That seems to be the basic problem. See, one of the curious things about multiculturalism is this idea that Britain is a diverse nation because we have all these different communities and cultures. But somehow that diversity ends at the edges of minority communities. That somehow minority communities are homogenous. That we can talk about each community having a set of particular needs. That's the problem. The problem is that minority communities are as diverse as Britain itself. And the problem with multicultural policy is that they fail to address that point and that question. They treat homogenous communities as minority as homogenous with certain set of pre-given ideas, notions, beliefs. There's Nassar Hadeh is a Danish MP, Muslim, not religious. He was talking at the time of the Danish cartoons, the story tells, to the editor of the leading left-wing paper who were highly critical of Danish cartoons. And Nassar said to him, he said, I'm not worried about Danish cartoons. I'm not critical of them. Let's get this right. The editor of the left-wing paper said, all Muslims in Denmark are opposed to the Danish cartoons. And Nassar said, I'm not. And the editor says, well, that's because you're not a proper Muslim. And the point is that what that kind of attitude does is noting that there is a kind of proper Muslim, a proper way of being of a community that is authentic, a proper way of being Muslim, a proper way of being Sikh, a proper way of being Hindu, a proper way of African Caribbean, and so on. That's what I'm challenging. That's why I'm opposed to the notion of a set of policies. Just briefly, just one question of the far right. People have raised it once in a while. The interesting thing about the far right, if you ever read the material of the BMP or the EDR, what's striking is that they're completely opposed to multiculturalism, but they use the language of multiculturalism. Can you just have just a little bit? They want to defend my culture, my history, my heritage. They say that if African Caribbeans can do it, why can't whites do it? And that seems to me kind of the greatest indictment of multiculturalism, is that it turns racism into another form of cultural identity. That's why it's important.
Yesterday afternoon, so I'm as British as you can probably get, I guess. But let me make the point. There have been a number of points made. One was about the EDL. I've been the subject of the EDL campaign throughout this year. Hundreds of emails being sent and letters being sent, including the Prime Minister, calling for me to be sacked and deported. I'm from Birmingham, I don't want to go back there. My point is that they don't like you regardless of what your message is, because you are against them. And that's I think, what the key one to make. And I totally agree with Ajman as well. We need to define what we're talking about here. Islam, there's nothing wrong with Islam. The first Muslim was the Prophet's wife. Forced marriage is adultery in Islam. It's not Islam, it's not Hinduism, Sikhism, Buddhism, or atheism. It's Muslims, some Sikhs, some Hindus, some agnostics, some atheists that I'm concerned about. They're the ones that I have to deal with on a daily basis. And to my mind, they will use whatever it is to support their case. And traditions are man-made. Let's make it very clear. It's man, and I'm being man in the gender sense, who make this. And men can change all of this if they want to. But of course, they would rather not do that. What multiculturalism does is say, don't be nosy. It says, mind your own business. It says, leave it alone. It says, live and let live. I buried people who because their families killed them, there was nobody there to bury them. Put yourself in those shoes. That we can't allow that to happen in our society, but we do, because we say, that's the way it should be, let them get on with it. We'll deal the consequences. We'll deal with the consequences, but we can't act upon it. We can't do something about it. Now, I'm absolutely certain that we need to look at where we are 10th of December 2012, not what we might do in the future to fix things. This is International Human Rights Day. It's really coincidental that it is. And it's really important to recognise that we stand up for everybody's rights, regardless of what their culture is. I say it regularly, human rights always trump cultural rights. They must always trump cultural rights. And we can't allow this situation to occur where we just simply say live and let live. I'd like to have a conversation, for example, about why it is that 1 in 8 people in prisons in this country are Muslims. I'd like to have that conversation. They're not there for terrorism. There's less than 200 there for terrorism. They're there because of drugs offences, because they are blighted by drugs more than anything else, anybody else. But I can't have that conversation because it'll be turned by the Mail, by Daily Mail or by others into some kind of racist conversation. I don't want to have that conversation in that context, but I want to have that conversation. I want to be able to explain to you what it is that we as society and community needs to do about this. Now, we are not together. You may live in London. You live in London, and London behaves as it does. When I go to Cumbria, which is one of my commands, I double the minority population when I go up there. You have a different approach to the way things are. We live in silos. It's not a melting pot. We have a line of herbs and a line of veg and a line of meat, never mixing, or if they do, it's by chance. And to my mind, we've got to recognise that's where we are. It's not a good thing. That's why we need to do something about it. Traditions, I go back to what I said, we can't have a situation where live and let live carries on. Regrettably, I deal with lots of people who live and let live to the end of their lives. Thank you.
That's it. And finally, to conclude the case for the proposition.
Okay, so from discussions running in politics and the media and around the world, and what we've seen here today, and some examples given by my colleagues, it is patent that multiculturalism has failed. But this could be because of perceptions of increased racist hostilities and decreased cultural tolerance, as much as perceptions of increased cultural tolerance, particularly towards Islamic values and practices. At the same time, philosophical discussions debate whether multiculturalism is conducive to greater equality and cohesion, or to greater inequality and segregation. Part of the problem is that there is an array of competing definitions of multiculturalism. Multiculturalism can mean many different things: a demographic condition, a set of institutional arrangements, objectives of a political movement, or a set of state principles. As defined by us, though, critically, state multiculturalism, institutional frameworks being employed in order to advance cultural equality, integration, and positive intergroup relations, has failed, and failed miserably at that. As we've been describing, with respect to the status quo, leaders are giving this form of intolerance, of tolerance, a second look. So how did we actually get to this sorry state of affairs? It started with the way that we actually teach history. Militarism, colonialism, and racism are all prominent ingredients of European history books, particularly our British history. For that matter, American history stresses these ingredients also, though all present an alarmingly ugly view of the Western past. We know that one of the advantages in the US is that they celebrate being, for example, Italian-American, but still focus on national identity. By presenting the West as repugnant and other civilizations as our prey, particularly during colonial days, but also in modern times, such as the recent advertising campaign by radical Christians in America, of which I had the misfortune of seeing myself, we encourage such social pathologies. Coming back to the debate tonight, they have actually missed the debate completely. Redefining the motion all the way down the table and multiculturalism, confusing diversity with multiculturalism, is not the way that you argue against the motion that we have here tonight. They have argued that multiculturalism itself cannot be stopped. It's very difficult to understand this position, and that the way that they actually make humour out of such sorry state of affairs. They say that it's all because of it is because we're all human at the end of the day. Unfortunately, this is not actually addressing the problems that we are facing here in the United Kingdom. Now, as Sir Humphrey Appleby said, a good political speech is not one in which you can prove that the man is telling the truth. It is one where no one else can prove he's lying. For reasons which we have made patent, multiculturalism is a political process to manage diversity. Multiculturalism has led to moral blindness. Populism is intolerance, and tolerance at what cost? Liberalism is not